medieval kingdom where power dictates destiny, one woman's fate changes overnight. Eleanor, a humble widow with nothing left to lose, is forced into a mockery of marriage with an unconscious king, a cruel ceremony designed to humiliate her while maintaining political appearances. The court laughs as she stands before the altar, a disposable pawn in their deadly game of thrones. But when a single tear falls from the comatose king's eye during their sham wedding, a tear only she notices, everything changes. While nobles plot and shadows gather, Eleanor alone begins to suspect a terrifying truth. The king wasn't struck by illness, but betrayed by those closest to him. As she forms an inexplicable connection with her sleeping husband, whispering to him in the darkness of night, she discovers something impossible. He can hear her. He's fighting to return. Now Eleanor must navigate a treacherous court where every smile hides a dagger, every ally could be an assassin, and the most dangerous man of all is watching her every move. Will her unwavering faith awaken a king from the brink of death? Or will the same poisonous plot that claimed him find her first? A esposa descartable. The church was filled to the rafters, yet silence hung like a shroud over the congregation. Not the reverent quiet of prayer, but the suffocating hush of collective shame, punctuated only by occasional whispers and stifled laughter. Stained glass windows cast blood-red and sapphire shadows across the stone floor, while incense swirled in the air, failing to mask the stench of hypocrisy that permeated the sacred space. At the altar, Eleanor trembled. Her slender fingers clutched a hastily arranged bouquet of wilting flowers, symbolic, she thought bitterly, of her own fading dignity. 28 winters had etched fine lines around her eyes, eyes that had already witnessed the death of one husband. Now, as a widow dressed in ill-fitting wedding garments, she stood before God and these vultures of nobility, being forced into a mockery of marriage. "Step forward," commanded the guard behind her, his gauntleted hand roughly shoving her shoulder. She stumbled, earning snickers from the front pews where ladies in fine silks hid cruel smiles behind ornate fans. Their eyes judged everything, from her plain dress to her poorly adjusted veil, from her commoner's posture to her sun-weathered hands. Eleanor hadn't been chosen for love, nor for honor. The truth was far more grotesque. She was to be wed to a king who hadn't opened his eyes in 3 months, a man trapped between life and death, breathing yet unreachable. A convenient solution to a diplomatic crisis. The kingdom needed a queen, and she, with no family to protest and no voice that mattered, was the perfect sacrifice. Why me? The question had tormented her since the royal guards had appeared at her cottage door 7 days prior. There were countless women of higher birth, greater beauty, better connections, but as she gazed at the sneering faces surrounding her, understanding dawned with crushing clarity. No woman of value would be wasted on such a farce. She was expendable, disposable. The bishop, corpulent and sweating beneath heavy ceremonial robes, stepped forward with undisguised contempt. His voice carried throughout the cavernous space, each word a deliberate wound. "Here stands the wife that nobody wanted," he proclaimed, pausing to allow the whispers to ripple through the congregation like poison. A fitting bride for a king who cannot refuse. Eleanor's heart constricted. She heard the laughter, not even bothering to be concealed now, and felt the weight of 100 cruel stares boring into her back. Her legs weakened. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to escape this humiliation. The gathered nobility waited with bated breath, anticipating, perhaps even hoping, that she would collapse or run, providing them with entertainment to gossip about for weeks to come. But something within her, perhaps the same stubborn will that had kept her alive through famine, war, and widowhood, stiffened her spine. She lifted her chin, though tears threatened to spill from her eyes. The ceremony proceeded like a nightmare. Vows were exchanged, though only one voice spoke them. When instructed to kiss her new husband, Eleanor was led to a side chamber where the king lay on a portable bed, attended by silent physicians. His once powerful frame now seemed diminished, his skin pale as parchment, his breathing so shallow she could barely detect it. With an audience of disapproving nobles watching, Eleanor leaned down and pressed her lips briefly against his cold, unresponsive mouth. The act felt like a violation, to both of them, a mockery of something that should have been sacred. And then it happened. As her veil brushed against the king's face, something impossible occurred, something only she, from her unique position, could see. A single tear escaped from beneath his closed eyelid, sliding down his temple before disappearing into his silver-streaked hair. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. Had she imagined it? The tear had appeared and vanished so quickly, like morning dew under the summer sun. She glanced around frantically, but no one else seemed to have noticed. The physicians were arranging the king's robes. The nobles were already turning away, bored with the spectacle, eager to proceed to the banquet where wine would flow freely. But she knew what she had seen. The king, this man trapped in endless slumber, this stranger who was now her husband, had shed a tear. Her mind raced with impossible questions. Could he hear? Could he understand? Was he somehow aware? The ceremony concluded without further incident. Eleanor was now queen of the realm, a title that, rather than conferring power, merely marked her as a new target for court intrigue and cruelty. As she was led from the altar, her new crown feeling like a ring of thorns upon her head, she couldn't shake the vision of that solitary tear. The procession moved toward the castle's great hall for the wedding feast, but Eleanor's thoughts remained in that side chamber with the sleeping king. If he could cry, perhaps he wasn't as lost as everyone believed. Perhaps somewhere, trapped within that still body, a man was fighting to return, and she alone had witnessed it. As she crossed the threshold of the church, stepping into the harsh sunlight of a world that had only contempt for her, Eleanor made a silent vow, not the false one she'd been forced to recite at the altar, but a true promise born of compassion and newfound purpose. She would discover the truth about the king's condition. She would be the one voice that believed in his return. She walked away from the altar in shock, the vision of that single tear etched into her mind, a secret that belonged to her alone. O peso da coroa. The feasting hall blazed with the light of 100 torches, their flames dancing across the faces of nobles whose laughter grew more raucous with each emptied goblet. Servants scurried between tables laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, and exotic fruits, a display of wealth that could have fed Eleanor's former village for a month. The smell of spiced wine and rich food filled the air, yet to Eleanor, it all tasted of ash. She sat alone at the high table, the empty throne beside her a stark reminder of the unconscious man to whom she was now bound. No one had approached to congratulate her, to welcome her into her new position. Instead, they raised their cups in mocking toasts that celebrated not the union, but the farce they had all participated in. "To our new queen," called out a portly duke, his face flushed with wine. "May her reign be as brief as her courtship." The hall erupted in laughter, cruel and cutting. Another nobleman stood, swaying slightly. "To the king's wisdom, even in sleep he chooses a bride no one would dare steal." More laughter cascaded through the hall like a poisonous wave. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the untouched plate before her. Her fingers gripped the arm of her chair, a chair that seemed too large, too ornate, too undeserving of her presence. The crown upon her head, though smaller than the king's, felt heavier with each passing moment. It pressed against her temples, a constant reminder of the role she had been thrust into without preparation or choice. A serving girl approached timidly, offering to refill Eleanor's water goblet. As she leaned forward, she whispered, "Don't let them see you cry, Your Majesty. It's what they want." Eleanor looked up, startled by the small act of kindness, but the girl had already moved on, disappearing into the crowd of servants. The brief interaction gave her the strength to lift her chin and observe the room through new eyes, the eyes of a queen, however unwanted. She noted how the nobles had formed tight circles, heads bent together in conspiratorial whispers, how they glanced at her between conversations, smirking and shaking their heads. She was not just an outsider. She was the subject of their entertainment, a diversion in the otherwise tedious politics of court life. After what felt like an eternity of enduring their thinly veiled insults, Eleanor rose from her seat. Protocol demanded she remain until the end of the banquet, but she found she could no longer breathe in the suffocating atmosphere of mockery. Without a word, she slipped away from the high table. unnoticed by most who were now too drunk to care about the presence or absence of a queen they didn't respect. The stone corridors of the castle were blessedly cool and quiet after the heat and noise of the feasting hall. Eleanor walked without direction, her footsteps echoing on the ancient flagstones. Tapestries depicting great battles and legendary kings lined the walls, their woven faces seeming to judge her as she passed. What right had she, a common widow, to walk these hallowed halls as their equal? As she rounded a corner, voices drifted from an alcove ahead. Two men engaged in hushed conversation. Eleanor instinctively stepped into the shadow of a column, her heartbeat quickening. "The council is growing impatient," said the first voice, rich with authority. "This charade with the peasant woman cannot continue indefinitely." "Patience, Lord Chamberlain," replied the second. "She serves our purpose for now. A placeholder on the throne while we secure our positions." "She's nothing but a commoner playing dress-up," scoffed the Chamberlain. "She won't last a week. She'll be just a name soon forgotten in the annals of this kingdom." Eleanor's knees nearly buckled beneath her. She pressed a hand against the cold stone wall to steady herself. These weren't just cruel nobles mocking her status. These were powerful men plotting against her, against the king. More than an unwanted wife, she was a pawn in their game, a temporary inconvenience to be discarded when she no longer served their purpose. The men's footsteps approached, and Eleanor quickly slipped down a side passage, her heart hammering in her chest. She found herself wandering through unfamiliar corridors, each turning leading deeper into the labyrinthine castle. After what seemed like hours, she recognized the ornate double doors that led to the king's chambers. Two guards stood at attention outside. They stiffened as she approached, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Did the new queen have the authority to enter? Did they owe her their allegiance? Their confusion reflected her own uncertain position. "I wish to see my husband," Eleanor stated, summoning all the authority she could muster into her voice. After a moment's hesitation, one guard nodded and opened the door for her. Inside, the royal bedchamber was dimly lit by a single lantern. A physician dozed in the corner, while the king lay motionless on his massive bed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, almost imperceptible breaths. Eleanor dismissed the physician with a quiet word. When they were alone, she approached the bed cautiously, studying the face of the man who was now her husband. In repose, the harshness of royal responsibility had softened from his features. He appeared younger, vulnerable in a way that caught her by surprise. She sat gently on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb him. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by their breathing, hers nervous and quick, his slow and measured. "If only you could hear me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "If only you knew what they're saying, what they're planning." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of frustration, of loneliness, of the overwhelming weight of her new reality. "I don't know why I'm here or what I'm meant to do. I'm surrounded by enemies in a place I don't belong." She wiped away a tear with the back of her hand. "I'm just a widow from the countryside. I know nothing of courts and crowns and conspiracies, but they made me your wife, and now I don't know if I'm your caretaker or your prisoner." In the stillness that followed her words, something extraordinary happened. The king's index finger, the one nearest to where her hand rested on the bed, twitched. It was a tiny movement, so slight she might have imagined it. But then it happened again, a deliberate motion against the silken sheets. Eleanor's breath caught. She stared at his hand, then at his face, searching for any other sign of consciousness. His features remained serene, unchanged, yet that finger had moved. She was certain of it. With trembling fingers, she reached out and took his hand in hers. It was warm, the skin surprisingly soft for a warrior king. "Can you hear me?" she whispered, hope rising in her chest like a fragile bird. "If you can hear me, show me again." For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, so faint she almost missed it, she felt the slightest pressure against her palm. His fingers had tightened ever so gently around hers. Eleanor's heart soared and plummeted simultaneously. Was this truly a response, or merely the reflex of a body that retained no conscious thought? She held his hand tighter, searching his face for any change, any sign that the man was still present within the sleeping form. "I'll come back tomorrow," she promised, her voice steady despite the tumult of emotions within her. "And the day after, and the day after that. I'll keep talking to you until you find your way back." As she sat in the quiet chamber, holding the hand of the sleeping king, Eleanor asked herself a question that made her chest tight with both fear and hope. Am I imagining this? Or is he trying to come back? O segredo, no quarto real. Night after night, Eleanor returned to the king's chambers, slipping through the castle like a ghost when the corridors emptied and the torches burned low. The guards at his door had grown accustomed to her visits, no longer questioning her presence or her motives. To them, she was merely fulfilling some strange duty, perhaps out of obligation, perhaps out of pity. They could not have imagined the truth. This night was no different. As the castle settled into slumber, Eleanor made her way through the winding passages, a small oil lamp guiding her path. The hem of her simple night robe, she had refused the elaborate silken garments offered to her, whispered against the stone floor. She had learned to move silently, to become invisible in a place where every eye watched and every ear listened. The king's chamber was warm, a fire crackling in the massive stone hearth. Eleanor dismissed the young physician's apprentice who had been keeping vigil, assuring him she would summon help if needed. When the door closed behind him, she set her lamp on the bedside table and took her now customary seat beside the king. In the firelight, his features seemed less pallid than before. Was it merely wishful thinking, or had some color returned to his cheeks? She studied him, noting the strong line of his jaw, now softened by the growth of a beard that his attendants kept neatly trimmed. His closed eyelids occasionally flickered, as though he were dreaming. "I'm back," she said softly, taking his hand in hers. It had become a ritual, these one-sided conversations in the quiet of night. "The castle is quite mad today. The Duke of Westerly arrived with his 3 daughters, each one more beautiful and arrogant than the last. They looked at me as though I were something their horses had stepped in." She laughed quietly, squeezing his hand. "You should have seen their faces when the steward addressed me as Your Majesty. I think the youngest nearly fainted from shock." As she spoke, she felt it, that now familiar, gentle pressure of his fingers against hers. It was happening more frequently now, these small responses. Last night, his breathing had changed when she'd described the sunset she'd watched from the eastern tower. The night before, a tear had slipped from beneath his eyelid when she'd hummed a folk song from her village. "I've been learning about you," she continued, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "The old chambermaid, Matilda, she told me how you used to sneak food from the kitchen as a boy, how you once released all the hunting falcons because you couldn't bear to see them hooded." She smiled at the thought. "I wouldn't have expected such gentleness from a king." A soft sigh escaped his lips. So quiet she might have missed it had she not been watching so intently. "You can hear me, can't you?" Eleanor leaned closer, her heart racing. "I know you're in there somewhere, fighting to come back." She reached out hesitantly, brushing a strand of dark hair from his forehead. The gesture felt bold, intimate, a liberty she would never have taken had he been awake. His skin was warm beneath her fingertips. "I won't tell them," she promised. "Not yet. They wouldn't believe me anyway. They think I'm nothing. A convenient puppet. A placeholder. If they knew you were responding..." She shuddered at the thought. It would be dangerous for both of us. For hours she sat with him, sometimes talking, sometimes reading from scrolls she'd found in the royal library, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence. With each visit, the strange connection between them deepened. It was as though she alone held the thread that was slowly pulling him back from whatever distant realm held his consciousness captive. As dawn approached, Eleanor reluctantly prepared to leave. The castle would soon stir, and she needed to be seen returning from her own chambers, not emerging from the king's. "I'll come back tonight," she said, rising from her chair. She leaned down and, in a moment of boldness that surprised even herself, pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Keep fighting, wherever you are." As she turned to retrieve her lamp, a sound stopped her. A distinct, unmistakable sound. A whispered word, barely audible. "Stay." Eleanor froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. Slowly she turned back to the bed. The king remained as he had been, eyes closed, expression serene. Had she imagined it? "My lord?" she whispered, moving closer again. "Did you speak?" Silence was her only answer. After several tense moments, Eleanor exhaled shakily. Perhaps it had been nothing more than the wind through the shutters or the settling of the ancient castle walls. Yet her heart refused to accept such rational explanations. She knew what she had heard. With renewed determination, Eleanor slipped from the chamber and made her way back through the castle, unaware that her midnight visits had not gone unnoticed. The following day brought new tensions. Eleanor felt the weight of suspicious gazes following her through the great hall, heard the whispers that ceased abruptly when she approached. Something had changed in the atmosphere of the court, a subtle shifting of alliances and suspicions. In the afternoon, while taking air in the private garden, she overheard two serving women gossiping by the lavender bushes. "They say she spends hours alone with him," said the younger one, a kitchen maid with ruddy cheeks and quick eyes. "Talking to a man who cannot hear nor respond. It's unnatural." "Unnatural indeed," agreed the older woman, who Eleanor recognized as a lady's maid to one of the more influential countesses. "Lady Beatrice says the new queen is touched in the head, deranged with loneliness. Imagine spending your nights conversing with a living corpse." The women's cruel laughter cut through Eleanor like a blade. She stepped back, concealing herself behind a stone column, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Was this how they saw her? A madwoman, pathetic and delusional. Worse still was the realization that her visits were known. She had been careful, or so she thought. But in a castle built on secrets and surveillance, true privacy was an illusion. That evening, Eleanor hesitated outside the king's chambers. The guards nodded respectfully as always, showing no sign that they viewed her any differently. Still, anxiety gnawed at her. If word of her nightly vigils had spread to the servants, how long before it reached the ears of those who might use such information against her? Yet the thought of abandoning the king, of leaving him alone in his twilight state, was unbearable. Steeling herself, Eleanor entered the chamber. The fire had burned lower than usual, casting long shadows across the room. She moved to the bedside, taking her place in the chair that now seemed molded to her form after so many nights. "They're talking about me," she said without preamble, her voice tight with emotion. "They think I've lost my mind, speaking to you like this." A bitter laugh escaped her. Perhaps they're right. Perhaps I've conjured these responses from desperation and loneliness. She looked down at his still face, doubt clouding her mind for the first time since she'd noticed that first tear during their wedding ceremony. "Am I a fool to believe you can hear me? To think that somewhere, behind those closed eyes, you're fighting to return?" As if in answer, the king's face contorted slightly, his brow furrowing as though in concentration or distress. His lips parted, and a sound emerged, not quite a word but more than a mere exhalation. A strained noise like someone trying to speak through great effort. Eleanor gasped, rising from her chair. "You're trying to speak," she whispered, leaning close. "What is it? I'm here, I'm listening." His lips trembled again. The sound that emerged was barely audible, a single word forced through the barriers of his condition. "No." Eleanor fell to her knees beside the bed, tears springing to her eyes. It wasn't imagined this time. She was certain. The king had spoken. One word, but it was enough. Proof that he wasn't lost, that he was fighting his way back from whatever abyss had claimed him. "I knew it," she whispered fiercely, clasping his hand between both of hers. "I knew you were still there." Caught in the moment of revelation, Eleanor failed to hear the soft creak of the chamber door, failed to notice the shadow that fell across the threshold. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Queen Eleanor?" The cold, imperious voice shattered the sacred moment like a stone through glass. Eleanor whirled around, rising to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the doorway stood a figure whose mere presence seemed to chill the air, a man whose power in the castle was second only to the king himself. and who, in the king's absence, had assumed authority with calculated precision. The chief counselor had discovered her secret. A Armadillo dos Nobres. Lord Cedric Blackthorne, chief counselor to the throne and de facto ruler of the kingdom since the king's affliction, stood in the doorway like a harbinger of doom. His tall figure, draped in rich velvet robes of midnight blue, seemed to absorb what little light remained in the chamber. The silver chain of office gleamed against his chest, each link representing power he had meticulously accumulated over decades of service, not to the crown, but to his own ambitions. Eleanor rose to her feet, instinctively positioning herself between the counselor and the king's bed. Her hands trembled, but she clasped them tightly before her to hide their shaking. "I am tending to my husband, Lord Blackthorne," she answered, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Is that not the duty of a wife?" His thin lips curved into what might have been mistaken for a smile, though it never reached his eyes. Cold, calculating eyes that had watched 3 kings reign and had influenced countless decisions from the shadows. "How touching," he said, stepping fully into the chamber and closing the door behind him with a soft but deliberate click. The devoted wife, keeping vigil by her husband's bedside. His gaze flickered to the king's still form before returning to Eleanor. "But we both know this is no ordinary marriage, don't we?" He moved further into the room, each step measured and purposeful. Eleanor held her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. "The servants talk," Blackthorne continued, running a finger along the edge of a nearby table, examining it for dust. "They say you speak to him for hours, that you believe he can hear you." His voice dripped with condescension. "Some even whisper that you claim to have seen him. Respond." The last word hung in the air between them, a dangerous accusation wrapped in silk. Eleanor lifted her chin. "And if I do?" Blackthorne's expression hardened. "Then you are either a fool or a liar. Neither is becoming in a queen, however temporary her position might be." "Temporary?" Eleanor echoed, her worst fears confirmed by his casual dismissal. "Come now," Blackthorne said, circling her like a predator. "You cannot possibly believe this arrangement was meant to last. You were convenient, nothing more. A body to fill a throne, a name to satisfy foreign diplomats who insisted the king must have a queen." He gestured dismissively toward the bed. "The king is as good as dead. His body lingers, but the man is gone." Anger flared in Eleanor's chest, burning away her fear. "You're wrong. He responds to me. He hears my voice." Blackthorne's laughter was sharp and cruel. "Does he? How fortunate that no one else has witnessed these miraculous responses." "I know what I've seen," Eleanor insisted. "What I've heard." "What you've imagined, you mean?" Blackthorne's voice softened to a dangerous purr. A lonely widow, thrust into a position far beyond her station, desperate for connection. It's understandable that your mind would create comforting fantasies. Eleanor's hands balled into fists at her sides. "It is no fantasy." "Then prove it." The challenge came swift and unexpected. "Prove to the court that our king is not lost to us. Demonstrate these responses you claim to have witnessed." The demand struck Eleanor like a physical blow. I cannot command him to respond. It doesn't work that way." "Of course it doesn't." Blackthorne smiled coldly. "How convenient for your delusion." "It is not a delusion." "Then you will have no objection to a public demonstration." Blackthorne moved to the door, his decision clearly already made. "Tomorrow, at midday, the entire court will gather to witness the Queen's miracle." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "And if he doesn't respond?" Blackthorne paused in the doorway. "Then perhaps the court will agree that a woman who speaks to corpses and imagines responses is not fit to wear a crown, even temporarily." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Without waiting for her reply, he departed, leaving Eleanor alone with the weight of his challenge crushing down upon her. She sank back into the chair beside the king's bed, her mind racing. What had she done? In her eagerness to believe, had she truly imagined the king's responses? The tear, the finger's movement, the whispered word, were they nothing more than desperate fabrications of a lonely heart? No, she was certain of what she had witnessed. But could she make it happen again, under the scrutinizing gaze of the entire court, with so much at stake? Eleanor spent the remainder of the night at the king's side, alternating between whispered pleas and silent prayers. By dawn, her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, her spirit frayed. Word of the impending demonstration spread through the castle like wildfire. By mid-morning, servants were exchanging bets on the outcome. Nobles were jockeying for the best positions from which to view the spectacle, and Eleanor was sick with dread. At precisely midday, the great hall filled with members of the court. The usual buzz of conversation was amplified, charged with anticipation. Eleanor stood at the entrance, watching as servants arranged a dais at the center of the hall, upon which the king's bed would be placed, turning his affliction into theater for the amusement of the nobility. Lord Blackthorn approached her, his expression one of feigned sympathy. "Still time to recant your claims, Your Majesty," he murmured, too softly for others to hear. "Admit you were mistaken, confused, perhaps overwhelmed by grief and responsibility." "I know what I saw," Eleanor replied, her voice barely audible but unyielding. Blackthorn's eyes hardened. "Then you leave me no choice but to expose your delusion to the court." He turned to address the assembled nobles. "My lords and ladies, Her Majesty has made extraordinary claims about our beloved king's condition. Today she will demonstrate the responses she alone claims to have witnessed." The crowd's murmuring intensified as 4 royal guards entered, bearing the king on his bed. They placed him carefully on the dais, arranging him so that all could see his still form. Eleanor felt bile rise in her throat at the indignity of it all. This proud man, this ruler, reduced to a curiosity for the entertainment of his court. She approached the dais, acutely aware of every eye upon her. The silence was deafening as she knelt beside the bed, taking the king's hand in hers, as she had done so many nights before. "Your Majesty," Blackthorn's voice cut through the silence, "perhaps you would care to explain to the court exactly what responses you have observed from our king?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "He has moved his fingers in response to my voice. He has shed tears, and—" she hesitated, knowing how it would sound. "He has attempted to speak." A wave of whispers swept through the hall. Some faces registered shock, others disbelief, and many, far too many, barely concealed amusement. "Indeed?" Blackthorn raised an eyebrow. "How remarkable that none of his physicians have observed such signs." He gestured expansively. "Please, demonstrate for us this miraculous connection you share." Eleanor turned back to the king, her heart hammering so violently she feared it might burst from her chest. The familiar features of his face seemed suddenly foreign under the harsh light of the great hall, the scrutiny of the court. This was nothing like the intimate quiet of his chambers, the gentle firelight, the privacy of their one-sided conversations. "Please," she whispered, leaning close to the king's ear. "If you can hear me, show them. Show them I'm not mad." Nothing happened. The king's chest rose and fell in the same shallow rhythm it had maintained for months. His fingers remained still within her grasp. His eyes stayed closed, his face serene and unresponsive. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. The silence in the hall grew heavier, punctuated by occasional coughs or shuffling feet. Eleanor could feel the weight of judgment pressing down upon her, could sense the growing certainty in the minds of the onlookers that she was, indeed, delusional. "It appears," Blackthorn finally said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "that the king remains as he has been, beyond our reach." Laughter, soft at first, then growing bolder, rippled through the assembly. Eleanor felt each chuckle like a knife between her ribs. Her face burned with humiliation, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "A pity," continued Blackthorn, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. "Perhaps now we can discuss more appropriate arrangements for the governance of the realm. Clearly our current queen is not of sound mind." Desperation clawed at Eleanor's throat. In one final instinctive gesture, she leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to the king's, a kiss born not of romance but of raw, human pleading. For several heartbeats nothing changed. The laughter grew louder, more confident. Blackthorn was already turning to address the court, triumph evident in every line of his body. Then it happened. A sound, low and strained, emerged from the king's throat. The hall fell silent instantly, as if a spell had been cast. Eleanor pulled back slightly, her eyes wide with hope and fear. The king's lips parted, and a weak but unmistakable groan escaped. His eyelids fluttered, though they remained closed. His fingers twitched within Eleanor's grasp, not the subtle movement she had felt in private, but a visible, undeniable motion. The crowd gasped collectively. Eleanor looked up, tears of vindication streaming down her face, to find Blackthorn staring at the king with an expression of mingled shock and fury. "You see?" she said, her voice carrying through the stunned silence of the hall. "He is still with us. He is fighting to return." The great hall erupted into chaos. Nobles pushed forward, straining to see the miracle for themselves. Servants crossed themselves in superstitious awe. Physicians rushed to examine the king, shouting contradictory orders at one another. And through it all, Lord Blackthorn stood frozen, his eyes locked with Eleanor's across the sea of commotion. In that gaze she read a promise that chilled her to her core. This was not over. It had only just begun. A esperanza e a amenaza. The days following the king's public response unfolded in a whirlwind of chaos and contradictions. The castle buzzed with conflicting whispers, some speaking of miracles and divine intervention, others of trickery and deception. Eleanor found herself at the center of a storm, both revered and reviled, depending on who was doing the speaking. The royal physicians, initially skeptical, now hovered around the king's bedside like anxious moths, documenting every twitch and sigh with newfound fervor. Some proclaimed it the beginning of an unprecedented recovery. Others insisted it was nothing more than involuntary reflexes, meaningless spasms of a body still in decline. The court had fractured into factions almost overnight. Those who had witnessed the king's response in the Great Hall could not deny what they had seen, yet their interpretations varied wildly. Some nobles, particularly those who had benefited from Lord Blackthorn's interim governance, dismissed the incident as coincidence, or more insidiously, as a clever manipulation by the new queen. Others, especially those who had chafed under Blackthorn's increasing authority, embraced the possibility of the king's return with cautious hope. These allies were few but valuable, approaching Eleanor in shadowed corridors with whispered support and promises of loyalty, should the king truly awaken. For Eleanor herself, the public demonstration had brought both validation and vulnerability. No longer could the court openly mock her as a madwoman speaking to an unresponsive husband. Yet in proving the connection between herself and the king, she had transformed from an object of ridicule to one of suspicion, and for some, fear. On the 5th morning after the incident, Eleanor entered the royal solar to find Lady Isolde of Highcliffe waiting for her. A widow of considerable influence and sharper intellect, Lady Isolde had observed the court's machinations from the periphery for decades, rarely involving herself in factional disputes. "Your Majesty," she said, rising and offering a curtsy that was precisely the correct depth, neither obsequious nor disrespectful. "I thought it time we spoke privately." Eleanor gestured for the attendants to leave them. When the door closed, she turned to the older woman with cautious curiosity. "What can I do for you, Lady Isolde?" The noblewoman's eyes, still keen despite her 60-odd years, assessed Eleanor with uncomfortable directness. "It's rather what I might do for you, Your Majesty. The court has split like an overripe fruit. Half believe the king shows signs of recovery, half insist it's an elaborate deception." "I know what I saw," Eleanor replied, the defense now automatic after days of doubt and questioning. "What everyone saw. Indeed, and therein lies your danger." Lady Isolde moved to the window, gazing out over the castle grounds. "Lord Blackthorn has governed in all but name since the king fell ill. He has appointed officials, redirected treasury funds, negotiated with foreign powers, all with the assumption that the king would never wake to question his decisions." A chill crept up Eleanor's spine. "You're suggesting he doesn't want the king to recover." "I'm suggesting," Lady Isolde said carefully, "that a king who sleeps forever is far more convenient than one who might awaken to find his kingdom altered beyond his wishes." She turned back to Eleanor. "And now you, a woman no one expected to matter, have given the court reason to hope for his return." The implications hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken. "I should be careful," Eleanor said softly. Lady Isolde's lips curved in a grim smile. "You should be vigilant. There are those who would see you silenced before you can facilitate the king's full awakening." After Lady Isolde's departure, Eleanor moved through her day in a haze of heightened awareness. Every servant's glance, every courtier's word seemed suddenly laden with double meanings. By evening, exhaustion had settled over her like a shroud, yet she knew she could not miss her nightly visit to the king, especially now, when his responses had become more frequent, more deliberate. The guards at his chamber door saluted her with newfound respect as she entered. The royal physician, an elderly man named Master Thaddeus, was examining the king, making notes on a piece of parchment. "Any changes today?" Eleanor asked, her voice betraying her weariness. Master Thaddeus glanced up, his expression guarded. "His breathing is stronger, heart rate steady. I noted 3 instances of finger movement and 1 vocalization. Whether these are meaningful responses or mere reflexes." He shrugged, unwilling to commit to either possibility. "Thank you, Master Thaddeus. You may retire for the evening." When they were alone, Eleanor took her customary place beside the king's bed. In the privacy of these chambers, away from the scrutiny of the court, she allowed her composure to falter. Tears welled in her eyes, born of frustration, fear, and a bone-deep fatigue. "Things have become complicated," she told him softly, taking his hand in hers. "The court is divided. Some believe you're coming back to us. Others insist it's impossible." She managed a weak smile. "I almost wish you could have seen their faces when you responded in the great hall." Lord Blackthorne looked as though he'd swallowed something particularly unpleasant. As had become their pattern, she felt the gentle pressure of his fingers against hers. The response came more quickly now, more definitely, a clear indication that he heard and understood. "Lady Isolde visited me today," she continued, drawing closer. "She warned me to be careful. It seems I've made enemies by believing in you." She laughed softly, without humor, as if I needed more reasons for the nobility to despise me. She described her day to him, the whispers that followed her through the corridors, the servants who now bowed deeper when she passed, the council members who watched her with calculating eyes. Throughout her account, the king's hand remained warm in hers, his fingers occasionally tightening in what she had come to interpret as encouragement. "I don't know who to trust," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every ally could be false, every kindness a trap. I'm not made for this world of intrigue, my lord. I'm a simple woman thrust into a nest of vipers." The king's brow furrowed slightly, a new response that sent a jolt of excitement through Eleanor. His lips parted, though no sound emerged. She leaned closer, heart racing. "Are you trying to speak again?" "I'm listening. I'm here." The struggle was visible on his face, muscles working against whatever force held him captive in his own body. Finally, his chest rose in a deeper breath than usual, and a single, strained word escaped. "Danger." Eleanor's blood froze. "Danger? Yes, I know there's danger. Lady Isolde warned me. But who? Who poses the greatest threat?" No further words came, though his agitation was evident in the quickening of his breath, the tension in his fingers. Eleanor squeezed his hand reassuringly. "It's all right. Don't strain yourself. I'll be careful, I promise." She remained with him until his breathing settled into its usual rhythm, until the lines of concentration smoothed from his brow. Only then did she rise to leave, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead as had become her custom. "Tomorrow," she promised, as she always did. The corridor outside the royal chambers was dimly lit, most of the castle already retired for the night. Eleanor moved quietly, her thoughts consumed by the king's warning and Lady Isolde's counsel. So distracted was she that she nearly missed the small, folded parchment that had been slipped beneath her chamber door. Inside her room, she unfolded the note with trembling fingers, holding it close to the candlelight to read the cramped, anonymous script. "Silence yourself, or be silenced forever." The threat was unambiguous, the implication chilling. Eleanor sank onto the edge of her bed, the parchment crumpling in her fist. For a moment, fear threatened to overwhelm her. But then, rising from the depths of her spirit, came a steely resolve she had not known she possessed. She had not survived famine, plague, and widowhood to be intimidated by shadows and whispers. She had not endured the court's mockery and cruelty to abandon the king now, when he needed her most. Whoever had left this threat had gravely misjudged her determination. With deliberate movements, she moved to the fireplace and cast the note into the flames, watching as the parchment curled and blackened, until nothing remained but ash. Let them threaten. Let them plot. She would not be swayed from her path. The following morning brought rain, fat droplets striking the castle windows like tiny fists demanding entry. Eleanor broke her fast alone in her chambers, unable to face the speculation and scrutiny of the great hall. A young serving girl brought fresh bread, cheese, and watered wine, setting the tray down with shaking hands. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked, noting the girl's pallor and nervous glance toward the door. Nothing, Your Majesty," the girl stammered, backing away. "Only, there's talk below stairs." "Strange talk." Eleanor gestured for her to continue. "They say the king moved yesterday, that he spoke." The girl's voice dropped to a whisper. "And that's some wish he hadn't." "Who says this?" "Everyone and no one, Your Majesty. Whispers in corners, words that stop when others approach." The girl twisted her apron anxiously. "Cook says we should keep our heads down and our ears closed if we value our positions." Before Eleanor could press further, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Master Thaddeus, his expression grave. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but I must speak with you urgently regarding the king." Eleanor dismissed the serving girl and turned to the physician. "What is it? Has his condition changed?" "Not precisely changed, no." Master Thaddeus hesitated. "But when I examined him this morning, I found something concerning." He lowered his voice, though they were alone. There were marks on His Majesty's pillow, indentations that could only have been made by... "By what?" Eleanor demanded, dread coiling in her stomach. "By someone pressing down," the physician said bluntly, as though to obstruct his breathing. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "You believe someone attempted to—" "I cannot say with certainty," Master Thaddeus interrupted quickly, "but I thought you should be aware." As the physician departed, Eleanor stood frozen, the realization dawning with horrifying clarity. The king's warning had not been abstract. The danger was immediate, tangible, and deadly. Someone had tried to murder the king in his sleep. Someone within the castle walls, someone with access to the royal chambers, and if they had tried once, they would surely try again. "A descoberta prohibida!" Rain lashed against the castle walls as Eleanor paced her chambers, her mind racing with the implications of Master Thaddeus's discovery. Someone had attempted to suffocate the king, a thought so monstrous it made her blood run cold. No longer was she facing mere court intrigue or personal threats. This was treason of the highest order, a direct assault on the crown itself. She needed proof, allies, information. But where to begin? Whom to trust? Every face in the castle now seemed masked, every smile potentially hiding murderous intent. The guards outside the king's chambers, the servants who brought his meals, the physicians who tended to him, or perhaps someone of higher rank with more to lose should the king awaken. As lightning split the sky outside her window, illuminating her chamber in stark momentary brightness, Eleanor made her decision. Knowledge was power, and she desperately needed both. She waited until the castle settled into its midday routine, when nobles retired to their chambers for rest or private meetings, and servants were occupied with preparations for the evening meal. Dressed in her plainest gown, one that would attract minimal attention, she made her way to the castle archives. Located in the eastern wing of the castle, the archives housed generations of royal documents, birth records, marriage contracts, death certificates, diplomatic correspondence, and medical histories. If she were to uncover the truth about the king's condition and perhaps identify those who wished him permanent harm, this was where she must begin. The archivist, a stooped man with parchment-thin skin and watery eyes, looked up in surprise as Eleanor entered his domain. Few ventured into this dusty labyrinth of shelves and scrolls. Fewer still were queens on a mission. "Your Majesty," he stammered, rising from his desk with difficulty. "This is unexpected. How may I serve?" "I wish to review His Majesty's medical records," Eleanor said, adopting the regal tone she had been practicing, the voice of a woman who expected to be obeyed without question. "All documents related to his current condition." The archivist's eyes widened slightly. "Those would be restricted, Your Majesty. By order of Lord Blackthorne, all records pertaining to the king's illness are sealed except to the council and royal physicians." "I am the Queen," Eleanor stated flatly. "The king's wife. Surely that grants me access to information about my husband's health?" The old man hesitated, conflict evident in his rheumy eyes. Protocol battled with hierarchy. Fear of Blackthorne warred with the authority of the crown Eleanor now wore. "Perhaps," Eleanor added, her voice softening, "you might simply direct me to the general section where royal medical records are kept. I would not wish to place you in a difficult position." Relief flooded the archivist's face at this compromise. "The western shelves, Your Majesty. Third row. The royal medical histories are bound in red leather." With a grateful nod, Eleanor moved in the direction indicated. Once out of the archivist's direct sight, she began scanning the shelves systematically. The medical records were organized chronologically, leather-bound volumes documenting the ailments, treatments, and health concerns of monarchs past. She located the current king's records quickly enough. The most recent volume, its leather binding still supple and unmarked by age. But as she reached for it, her eye caught something peculiar. A slim folder tucked behind the bound volumes, partially hidden as though someone had intended it to be overlooked. Curiosity piqued, Eleanor carefully extracted it. The folder contained loose parchment sheets rather than bound pages, the handwriting hurried and less formal than the meticulous script of the official records. These appeared to be personal notes, perhaps from one of the royal physicians. The dates corresponded to the period just before and after the king's collapse into his comatose state. Heart-pounding, Eleanor began to read, her eyes widening with each paragraph. The notes described symptoms inconsistent with natural illness: sudden onset, peculiar discoloration of the fingernails, unusual pupil dilation, the distinct scent of almonds on the breath. Most damning of all was a hastily scrawled notation: suspect foreign agent introduced to evening meal. Similar presentation to cases documented in Venetian poisoning treatise. Poison. Not illness, not a mysterious malady, but deliberate poisoning. Eleanor's hands trembled as she continued reading. The physician had begun a course of treatment based on his suspicions. Subtle counteragents administered while claiming they were standard remedies. The last entry, dated 3 days after the king's collapse, read simply, "Treatment interrupted, relieved of duties by council order." The physician had been removed, silenced, and the king had remained in his twilight state, hovering between life and death, neither recovering nor succumbing. Eleanor carefully replaced the official volume, but slipped the folder of notes into the folds of her gown. The knowledge burned like fire in her mind. The enemy was not outside the castle walls, but within them. Someone close to the king, someone with access to his food, his chambers, his trusted circle, had attempted to murder him. And when that failed, they had ensured he remained incapacitated by halting the treatment that might have saved him. As she turned to leave, a shadow fell across the shelf before her. The archivist stood at the end of the row, his expression unreadable. "Did you find what you sought, Your Majesty?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor forced a smile. "Not entirely. The medical terminology is rather beyond my understanding. I shall consult with Master Thaddeus instead." The old man nodded slowly. "A wise decision. Some knowledge is dangerous when misinterpreted." Was there a warning in his words? Eleanor couldn't be certain, but she felt the weight of the hidden documents against her side as she made her way out of the archives. Had he seen her take them? Would he report her actions to Blackthorne or others in the council? She walked briskly through the corridors, fighting the urge to run. Knowledge was indeed power, but it was also dangerous, and she had just armed herself with the most dangerous knowledge of all. By evening, the rain had subsided to a gentle patter against the castle windows. Eleanor sat in her chambers, the physician's notes spread before her on the table, reading them for the fourth time as though they might reveal new secrets with each examination. The evidence was clear, but incomplete. Someone had poisoned the king, but who? The notes named no suspects, offered no hints as to who might have had motive or opportunity. And with the original physician removed from his duties, perhaps permanently, she had no one to question directly. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Hastily gathering the papers, she concealed them beneath a cushion before calling, "Enter." It was Lady Isolde, her usual composure fractured by what appeared to be genuine concern. "Your Majesty," she said without preamble, "you were seen in the archives today." Eleanor's heart sank. News travels quickly in these walls. "More quickly than you know. Lord Blackthorn has called a council meeting for dawn tomorrow. The topic, I'm told, is the Queen's concerning behavior and questionable activities. He means to move against me," Eleanor said, the realization settling like lead in her stomach. Lady Isolde's nod was grim. "You've become more than an inconvenience. You're now a threat, especially if you've discovered anything significant in those archives." Eleanor studied the older woman carefully, weighing risk against necessity. Finally, she made her decision. "The king was poisoned," she said softly, "and his treatment was deliberately halted to ensure he would not recover." To her credit, Lady Isolde showed little surprise. "You have proof of this?" "Notes from the original physician, hidden behind the official records." "May I see them?" Against her better judgment, but desperately needing an ally with greater knowledge of court politics, Eleanor retrieved the documents from their hiding place. Lady Isolde examined them with an expert's eye, her finger tracing specific lines, her brow furrowing at particular passages. "This physician," she said finally. "Do you know what became of him?" Eleanor shook her head. "The notes end with his removal from duties." "I don't even know his name. It's not recorded in these informal observations." "Gavin of Westmere," Lady Isolde supplied. "A brilliant physician, trained in Salerno. He vanished shortly after the king fell ill. The official word was that he had been called home on family business, but no one has heard from him since." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. "You believe he was—" "I believe," Lady Isolde interrupted carefully, "that a man who knows too much about a royal poisoning might find it healthier to disappear than to remain where certain powerful individuals could reach him." She handed the documents back to Eleanor. "You understand what this means? The poison used was sophisticated, rare, not the work of a common criminal or lone malcontent. This was planned, executed by someone with resources, knowledge, and significant motive." "Blackthorn," Eleanor whispered. Lady Isolde's expression remained neutral. "He has certainly benefited most from the king's incapacitation, but accusations against the chief counselor require absolute proof, not circumstantial evidence or conjecture. These notes alone are not enough." "Then what do I do?" "The council meets at dawn. If Blackthorn means to move against me—" "You need to secure your position," Lady Isolde said pragmatically. "Return to the king. Your connection to him, whatever its nature, is your only shield against Blackthorn's ambitions. If the court believes the king responds to you, they will not dare remove you. Not yet." After Lady Isolde departed, Eleanor concealed the physician's notes in a loose stone beneath her bed, a hiding place she had discovered days earlier. Then, with determination hardening her resolve, she made her way to the king's chambers for her nightly visit. The guards admitted her without question, but as she entered the dimly lit room, something felt immediately wrong. The air was too still, the silence too complete. Her instincts screamed a warning. She moved to the bed with caution and froze. The king's breathing seemed labored, his complexion ashen, and on his pillow, clearly visible in the lamplight, were strange indentations that hadn't been there earlier in the day. Someone had been here, recently, and they had tried again. As the realization crashed over her, Eleanor failed to hear the soft footsteps behind her, failed to notice the shadow that fell across the floor. "I wondered when you would return, Your Majesty." The voice, smooth, cultured, and deadly as a poisoned blade, sent ice through her veins. She whirled around to find herself face to face with a man whose ambition had already cost one life, and now threaten 2 more. You've been remarkably persistent, he continued, closing the chamber door with a soft click, and increasingly troublesome. Obejo que mudo tudo. The chamber seemed to shrink around Eleanor as Lord Blackthorne stepped closer, his shadow elongating across the stone floor like a physical manifestation of his reach and power. His face, usually composed into a mask of aristocratic indifference, now bore an expression she had never seen before, a cold, calculating intensity that made her blood freeze in her veins. "Did you truly believe no one was watching you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filling the room completely. A queen who spends her nights whispering to a sleeping king, who rummages through archives, who conspires with the likes of Lady Isolde. He clicked his tongue in mock disappointment. So many missteps for someone in such a precarious position. Eleanor stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. She positioned herself between Blackthorne and the king's bed, a futile gesture of protection, perhaps, but the only one available to her. "What have you done to him?" she demanded, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. A thin smile played across Blackthorne's lips. "Nothing he won't recover from. Or rather, nothing he would have recovered from had you not interfered with your attachment." He moved to the window, glancing out at the night sky before drawing the heavy curtains closed. He was meant to sleep indefinitely, you see, neither dead, which would have raised uncomfortable questions, nor alive enough to rule. The perfect solution. "You poisoned your own king," Eleanor said, the words both accusation and confirmation. "Why? For power? For the throne?" "For the good of the realm," Blackthorne countered, his tone suggesting genuine belief in his own justification. "Alexander is a good man, perhaps too good, compassionate to a fault, unwilling to make the harsh decisions necessary for a kingdom's survival." His lip curled slightly. "He would have bankrupted the treasury with his charity, weakened our borders with his diplomacy." Eleanor's mind raced, searching for a way out of this deadly confrontation. The guards outside, could they hear if she screamed? Would they intervene against the chief counselor, whose authority they had obeyed for months? And now, Blackthorne continued, his attention shifting to a small vial he withdrew from within his robes. "You've forced my hand. A pity. I had hoped your position as figurehead queen would be temporary, but ultimately harmless." The vial gleamed in the lamplight, a tiny vessel of amber glass containing clear liquid. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as understanding dawned. "You intend to poison me as well," she stated, not a question, but a realization. Blackthorne inclined his head in acknowledgement. "A tragic case of melancholia, driven by your overwhelming grief at the king's condition. The court physician, one more sympathetic to reason than Master Thaddeus, will confirm it. The kingdom will mourn briefly, then continue under steady guidance." He stepped forward, the vial extended in one hand. "You may take it willingly, I've ensured it's painless, or I can summon guards who will testify to your increasingly erratic behavior. Either way, by dawn, the problem you present will be resolved." Eleanor backed away until she felt the edge of the king's bed against her legs. There was nowhere left to retreat. Her mind scrambled desperately for options, for some way to survive this moment. In her panic, her hand found the king's, gripping it tightly, a reflexive gesture of connection in what might be her final moments. And then, miraculously, she felt it. A pressure against her palm, weak but deliberate. The king's fingers tightened around hers. Hope flared within her chest, small but fierce. She wasn't alone in this fight. "You've miscalculated, Lord Blackthorne," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The king responds to me. The court has witnessed it. If I die suddenly, especially after visiting the archives, suspicion will fall directly on you." Uncertainty flickered briefly across Blackthorne's features, but his composure returned quickly. "A risk I'm prepared to manage. After all, who would believe the accusations of a dead woman?" He took another step forward. "Now, will you choose dignity, or must this become unpleasant?" A sharp rap at the chamber door interrupted the deadly standoff. Both Eleanor and Blackthorne froze as the door swung open without waiting for a response. Sir Roland, captain of the king's personal guard and a knight renowned for both his fighting prowess and unwavering loyalty to the crown, stood in the doorway. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his hand rested meaningfully on the pommel of his sword. "Your Majesty," he addressed Eleanor with a formal bow, "I apologize for the intrusion, but there's a matter requiring your immediate attention in the Eastern Tower." Blackthorn's hand, still holding the vial, disappeared swiftly into the folds of his robe. "Captain," he acknowledged stiffly, "the Queen and I are discussing matters of state. Surely whatever requires her attention can wait until morning." Sir Roland's gaze shifted between them, his expression unreadable. Had he sensed the tension in the room? Had he seen the vial before Blackthorn concealed it? Eleanor couldn't be certain, but she seized the opportunity with desperate gratitude. "Not at all, Lord Blackthorn," she said, moving quickly toward the door. "As Queen, I must attend to all matters concerning the kingdom. However unexpected they may be." Blackthorn's jaw tightened, but with Sir Roland present, he could do nothing to stop her. "We will continue our discussion tomorrow, Your Majesty." In council. The threat lingered in the air as Eleanor followed Sir Roland into the corridor, her legs trembling so violently she feared they might give way beneath her. They walked in silence until they were well away from the king's chambers, until they reached a narrow, spiraling staircase that indeed led to the Eastern Tower. "There is no matter requiring my attention, is there?" Eleanor asked quietly as they began to ascend. Sir Roland glanced back at her, his expression grave. "No, Your Majesty." But there was something in Lord Blackthorn's manner that suggested intervention was necessary. Relief washed over Eleanor in a dizzying wave. "You saved my life, Sir Roland." The knight's weathered face betrayed the barest hint of emotion. Concern, perhaps, or determination. "I serve the crown, Your Majesty. Always." He paused at a landing, checking that they were truly alone before continuing. "There have been rumors among the guards. Strange orders, unusual movements in the night. Many of us have grown concerned about the direction of the council under Lord Blackthorn's guidance." Hope bloomed in Eleanor's chest, tentative, fragile, but real. "Then I am not without allies. The king is beloved by many who serve him directly, those who remember his justice, his mercy." Sir Roland's voice lowered further. "And there are those who have noted the Queen's devotion, her belief when others had abandoned hope. It has not gone unrecognized." They reached the top of the tower, where a simple chamber lay open to the night air on one side, offering a commanding view of the castle grounds and the surrounding countryside. The storm had passed, leaving the sky clear and star-filled, the moon casting silver light across the landscape. "You'll be safe here for the night," Sir Roland said. "This tower is used only by the royal astronomers, who won't return until tomorrow evening. I'll post guards I trust implicitly at the base of the stairs." "And the king?" Eleanor asked, fear clutching at her heart. "Blackthorn might. I've already arranged for loyal men to guard his chamber," Sir Roland assured her. "No one will approach him without my knowledge." When the night departed, Eleanor sank onto a wooden bench, exhaustion crashing over her like a physical wave. She had escaped death by moments, saved by the intervention of an unexpected ally. But the respite was temporary. Come morning, Blackthorn would rally the council against her. Without proof of his treachery, proof beyond the hidden physician's notes, which would be dismissed as forgeries, she had no way to counter his influence. Her only hope remained the king himself. If he could somehow awaken, truly awaken. Sleep claimed her eventually, huddled against the stone wall of the tower, dreams filled with poison vials and shadowed corridors that led nowhere. She woke to gentle shaking, a hand on her shoulder. Dawn light streamed into the tower chamber, illuminating Sir Roland's face, and the urgency written there. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, but we must move quickly. Lord Blackthorn has called the council to session earlier than expected. They gather now." Eleanor rose, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs from sleeping in such uncomfortable conditions. "To condemn me as a madwoman, no doubt, or worse, a traitor." "Perhaps," Sir Roland acknowledged grimly, "but there is something you must see first." He led her down the tower stairs at a pace that bordered on dangerous, through corridors still shadowed in pre-dawn dimness, taking servants' passages and lesser-known routes to avoid encounter. When they reached the king's antechamber, Eleanor was startled to find it crowded with royal physicians, servants, and guards, all speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "What's happened?" she demanded, fear clenching her heart. "Is he alive?" Sir Roland assured her quickly. "More than alive. He called for you, Your Majesty. In the night, he spoke your name." The world seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. "He spoke? Clearly?" "Not clearly, no, but distinctly enough that the night physician recognized it as your name." Sir Roland's eyes shone with something like wonder. "It's the first purposeful speech since he fell ill. Master Thaddeus believes it signals a potential awakening." Hope surged through Eleanor's veins, dizzying in its intensity. "I must see him." The crowd parted as she approached the bedchamber doors. Inside, the king lay as he had for months, eyes closed, body still. Yet there was something different about him. A quality to his breathing, perhaps, a subtle change in coloration. Master Thaddeus stood nearby, observing with clinical interest. "Your Majesty," the elderly physician acknowledged her with a bow. "A remarkable development. His vital signs strengthened by the hour. Brain activity, as measured by a pupil response to light, has increased significantly." Eleanor moved to the bedside, taking the king's hand in hers as she had done countless times before. "I'm here," she said softly. "I came as soon as I heard." For several moments, nothing happened. The chamber fell silent, every eye fixed on the still figure of the king. Eleanor leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alexander," she said, using his name for the first time rather than his title. "If you can hear me, if you're trying to come back to us, to me, I'm listening. I'm waiting." His breathing changed subtly, quickened, deepened. His fingers twitched against hers, but his eyes remained closed, his consciousness still trapped somewhere beyond reach. Desperation clawed at Eleanor's throat. Blackthorn and the council gathered even now, preparing to strip her of what little authority she possessed, perhaps to condemn her to death. Without the king to counter their power, she stood no chance. In that moment of purest despair, Eleanor acted on instinct rather than reason. Leaning forward, she pressed her lips to the king's, not a dutiful peck as at their wedding ceremony, but a true kiss, born of genuine emotion. In it, she poured everything: her fear, her hope, her newfound courage, and the strange, unexpected affection that had grown from her nights of one-sided conversations with this man she barely knew, yet had come to care for deeply. "Come back," she whispered against his lips. "Please." The room collectively held its breath. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then, like the breaking of a spell in ancient legends, the king's eyes opened. Eleanor gasped, pulling back slightly as awareness flooded his gaze. Confusion, pain, and recognition cycling rapidly across features that had remained impassive for so long. The chamber erupted in exclamations of shock and wonder. Master Thaddeus pushed forward, disbelief written across his weathered face. Guards dropped to their knees in spontaneous obeisance, but Eleanor saw none of it. Her world had narrowed to the man before her, his eyes, a startling blue she had never truly seen before, now fixed on her face with an intensity that stole her breath. His lips parted, dry from months of disuse. With visible effort, he formed his first conscious words since falling into his twilight state. "You," he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper that nonetheless carried clearly in the suddenly silent chamber. "Who are you?" "A verdade et a redemption." Time seemed suspended in the chamber as the king's question hung in the air. His voice, though weak from disuse, carried an undeniable authority that sent ripples of reaction through those gathered. Physicians exchanged glances of astonishment, guards straightened to attention, and servants pressed themselves against the walls as though witnessing something too sacred for their proximity. Eleanor's heart contracted painfully. Of course he wouldn't know her. Their marriage had been performed while he lay unconscious, their relationship forged entirely through her one-sided vigils. To him, she was a stranger, albeit one he had awakened to find kissing him. "I am Eleanor," she said softly, still holding his hand. "I am She hesitated, uncertain how to explain the complexities of their situation. "She is your wife, your majesty," Master Thaddeus supplied, stepping forward with a bow. "Queen Eleanor." Confusion clouded the king's features. He tried to sit up, wincing at the weakness of muscles unused for months. Sir Rowland moved quickly to assist him, arranging pillows to support his back. "Wife?" the king echoed, his gaze returning to Eleanor's face with new intensity. "I have no wife. I never married." A tense silence fell over the room. How much should they tell him, and how quickly? His mind was clearly sharp despite his physical weakness. The confusion in his eyes was not that of a man with damaged faculties, but of one confronted with an impossible situation. "There is much to explain, my lord," Eleanor said gently. "You have been asleep for a very long time." "How long?" the king demanded, his voice gaining strength with each word. 3 months and 17 days, your majesty," Master Thaddeus answered. "You fell ill suddenly at the autumn feast. Since then, you have been in a state between sleep and waking, unresponsive to all stimuli until recently." The king's gaze swept the chamber, taking in the faces surrounding him, some familiar, others unknown to him. When his eyes returned to Eleanor, they held a mix of wariness and curiosity. "And you claim to be my queen, married while I slept?" The question held no accusation, only bewilderment. Why would such a thing be arranged? Before Eleanor could answer, the chamber door burst open. Lord Blackthorn stood on the threshold, flanked by 2 council members, his face a mask of carefully controlled shock that did not quite conceal the fury beneath. "Your Majesty," he said, executing a deep bow that could not disguise the tension in his shoulders. "We had heard rumors, but dared not believe. This is a miracle beyond all expectation." The king's expression shifted, recognition dawning. "Lord Blackthorn, my chief counselor." "At your service, as always," Blackthorn replied smoothly. His gaze flicked briefly to Eleanor, cold as winter frost. "I see you have met your wife." The subtle emphasis on the word was not lost on anyone present. The king frowned, clearly sensing undercurrents he did not yet understand. "So I am told," he said carefully, "though I confess, the circumstances of this union remain unclear to me." Blackthorn stepped further into the room, assuming the air of authority that had served him well in the king's absence. "A diplomatic necessity, your majesty. The northern kingdoms threatened war unless you took a bride. The council acted in your best interest while you were indisposed." It was a lie so bold, so seamless in its delivery, that Eleanor nearly gasped aloud. The northern kingdoms had made no such demand. Her marriage had been Blackthorn's cynical solution to maintaining appearances while he ruled from the shadows. But before she could speak, Sir Rowland stepped forward, his weathered face set in lines of stern disapproval. "Forgive me, Lord Blackthorn, but that is not the account I recall." His hand rested meaningfully on his sword hilt. "Perhaps we should present His Majesty with the true circumstances of recent events, rather than convenient revisions." Tension crackled in the air like summer lightning. Blackthorn's eyes narrowed, his hand moving subtly toward something concealed in his robes, the poison vial from the previous night. Eleanor wondered with a jolt of fear. But with so many witnesses present, he could hardly act openly against any of them. The king observed the exchange with growing alertness, his gaze sharpening as he recognized the conflict playing out before him. "It seems," he said, his voice gaining strength and authority with each word, "that there are various accounts of what has transpired during my absence." He shifted his attention to Eleanor. "I would hear yours, my lady, before any other." The chamber fell silent. This was her moment, to speak truth, to expose treachery, to establish herself not as the mockery of a queen they had intended, but as the woman who had kept faith when all others had abandoned hope. Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "You fell ill suddenly, my lord, not through natural causes, but by deliberate poisoning." Gasps and murmurs erupted around the room. Blackthorn's face darkened with fury, but the king silenced all with a raised hand, gesturing for her to continue. "Your original physician suspected as much and began treatment, but was removed from his position before he could complete your cure. Instead, you were kept in a twilight state, neither healing nor worsening, while Lord Blackthorn ruled in your name. She recounted everything. How she, a widow of no particular importance, had been chosen as a convenient figurehead, forced to marry an unconscious king in a ceremony meant to be nothing but political theater. How she had noticed his tear during the wedding, had begun her nightly vigils, had discovered his subtle responses when everyone else had given him up for lost. I found the physician's hidden notes in the archives yesterday, she continued, aware of Blackthorn's increasingly murderous glare. Notes documenting the poison's effects and the treatment that might have awakened you months ago, had it been allowed to continue. The king listened intently, his expression shifting between disbelief, anger, and something more complex when he looked at Eleanor, a mixture of wonder and gratitude that made her heart beat faster. And last night, she concluded, her voice dropping to ensure every word was heard clearly, Lord Blackthorn confronted me in this very chamber with a vial of poison, intending to silence me permanently. All eyes turned to Blackthorn, whose composure finally cracked. Lies, he spat. The desperate fabrications of a commoner who found herself accidentally elevated beyond her station. Your Majesty, surely you cannot believe this fiction. The king studied his chief counselor for a long moment, his gaze penetrating. I have known you for 15 years, Cedric, he said quietly. In that time, I have never seen you lose your composure. Until now. With surprising strength for a man so recently awakened from months of near death, the king turned to Sir Roland. Captain, I would have Lord Blackthorn escorted to the Eastern Tower for questioning. Ensure he is searched thoroughly for any vials he might be carrying. As Blackthorn was led away, protesting vehemently, the king requested the chamber be cleared of all save Eleanor and Master Thaddeus. When they were alone, he sank back against the pillows, exhaustion etching lines in his face. Is what you say true? He asked Eleanor directly. All of it? Every word, my lord. The king turned to Master Thaddeus. And you, old friend? What is your assessment? The elderly physician stroked his beard thoughtfully. The symptoms you displayed were indeed consistent with certain rare poisons, and it is true that Gavin of Westmere, a physician of considerable skill, was removed from your care under suspicious circumstances. And the lady? The king's gaze returned to Eleanor. What of her claims regarding my responses to her presence? Master Thaddeus's expression softened. I witnessed them myself, your Majesty. When all others had abandoned hope, she maintained a vigil by your side, and you responded, subtly at first, then with increasing clarity. It was to her voice, her touch, that you reacted when nothing else could reach you. The king absorbed this information silently, his gaze never leaving Eleanor's face. There was something in his eyes, a searching quality, as though trying to reconcile the stranger before him with the voice that had guided him back from the abyss. Leave us, he finally said to the physician. When they were alone, he gestured for Eleanor to sit beside him. You were forced to marry a corpse, he said bluntly. A mockery of a union, meant to humiliate you and provide a convenient political fiction. Eleanor nodded, unable to deny the truth of his assessment. Yet you defended that same corpse when it would have been easier, safer, to play the role assigned to you. His voice held genuine puzzlement. Why? The question caught her off guard. Why indeed? She had asked herself the same countless times during those long nights by his bedside. At first it was compassion, she answered honestly. No one deserves to be abandoned, especially in such a vulnerable state. Then, when I noticed your responses, she hesitated, searching for words to explain the inexplicable connection that had formed. It became something else, a purpose, a belief that you were fighting to return and needed someone to fight alongside you. A faint smile touched the king's lips. And so you did. Against the entire court, against threats to your own life. He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. I remember, you know. Not clearly, not completely, but in fragments. A voice in the darkness. Stories told beside my bed. A hand holding mine when I thought I was lost forever. Eleanor's heart quickened. You heard me? Like a beacon guiding a ship through fog, he confirmed. When everything else was shadow and confusion, your voice was clear, constant. For several moments they sat in silence, the weight of shared experience, however unusual, creating a bond that defied conventional understanding. Our marriage was a farce, the king finally said. A ceremony performed without my consent or your desire. By all rights, it should be annulled immediately. Eleanor nodded, ignoring the unexpected pang in her chest. Of course, he would not want to remain bound to a stranger, a commoner thrust upon him during his incapacitation. However, he continued, his voice softening, I find myself in the unprecedented position of owing my life to the woman who was forced to be my wife. His fingers tightened around hers. Perhaps in time we might consider a true marriage, one entered into with full awareness and mutual choice. Before Eleanor could respond, commotion erupted in the antechamber. The doors flew open to admit Sir Roland, his expression grim. Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but Lord Blackthorn has confessed. When confronted with the evidence from the archives and testimony from the guards, he admitted to the poisoning, though he insists it was done for the good of the realm. The king's jaw tightened. Bring him before me. Within the hour, a hastily assembled court filled the great hall. The king, still weak but refusing to appear anything less than fully in command, sat upon his throne for the first time in nearly 4 months. Beside him, in the queen's seat, sat Eleanor, no longer an object of mockery, but a figure regarded with newfound respect and not a little awe. Lord Blackthorn stood before them, his aristocratic bearing diminished by the guards flanking him, but his expression remained one of defiant certainty rather than remorse. You were my most trusted advisor, the king said, his voice carrying throughout the silent hall. You broke that trust in the most fundamental way possible. I acted for the good of the kingdom, Blackthorn replied, his chin lifted. Your policies of mercy and moderation were weakening our position. The treasury drained by your charitable projects, our enemies emboldened by your reluctance to use force. Enough, the king cut him off. You appointed yourself the arbiter of what was best for my people, as though your judgment superseded the crown you swore to serve. His gaze swept the assembled court, noting the faces of those who had participated in the deception, those who had remained silent, and the few who had maintained their loyalty. This woman, he continued, gesturing to Eleanor, whom you intended as nothing more than a temporary placeholder, a joke to amuse the court. This woman you scorned for her common birth and ridiculed for her faith in me. She alone showed the courage and loyalty that all of you swore in your oaths of fealty. Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, some ashamed, others calculating, many simply astonished by the dramatic reversal of fortune they were witnessing. Without her, the king declared, his voice strengthening with each word, I would not be here. Without her persistence, her compassion, her unwillingness to abandon hope when it seemed foolish to do otherwise, I would have remained lost in darkness. He rose from his throne, still unsteady but determined to stand as he delivered judgment. This woman who entered this castle as a widow you deemed disposable has earned her place at my side not through birth or arrangement, but through the purest demonstration of the virtues you all claim to uphold. The court fell into absolute silence as the king turned to Eleanor, taking her hand and raising her to stand beside him. Sometimes, he said, his voice softer, but still carrying to every corner of the hall, the heart that is most despised contains the greatest strength. This is the lesson that will be remembered long after today's judgment fades from memory. In that moment as she stood beside the king, not as a figurehead or a convenient political fiction, but as a woman recognized for her own courage and compassion, Eleanor felt the weight of every humiliation, every mockery, every cruel word lift from her shoulders. She had entered this castle as a sacrifice, expected to fade into insignificance. Instead, she had found purpose, strength, and an unexpected chance at happiness. The journey ahead would not be simple. The king had months of recovery before him. The court had deep fractures to heal, and their own relationship, born in such unusual circumstances, would need time to find its natural course. But as she stood there, her hand in his, Eleanor knew that whatever challenges awaited, she would face them with the same determination that had guided her through the darkest nights at his bedside. Not as a disposable wife, but as a queen who had earned her crown through the most powerful force of all, the refusal to abandon hope when all seemed lost. Eleanor's journey reminds us that true strength often resides in unexpected places. When the powerful mocked her, when nobles dismissed her as nothing more than a disposable wife, she chose compassion over bitterness, perseverance over surrender. In a world that valued bloodlines and power, she demonstrated that the most formidable quality is unwavering faith in the face of overwhelming doubt. What would you have done in her position? Would you have maintained hope when everyone around you insisted it was foolish? Would you have risked everything to fight for someone who, to the world, was already lost? Sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not performed on battlefields, but in quiet moments of determination when no one is watching. Eleanor's steadfast vigil at the king's bedside, speaking to him night after night when others had abandoned hope, changed not only his fate, but the entire kingdom's. Her story challenges us to consider who in our lives might need our unwavering belief when they cannot fight for themselves. What voices are we dismissing simply because they come from those we consider unimportant? If this story touched your heart, remember that we all face moments where we must choose between accepting the role others assign us and standing firm in our own truth. Like Eleanor, we can transform from the person others believe us to be into the person we're meant to become. Don't forget to follow our channel for more stories that stir the soul. Leave a like if Eleanor's journey moved you, and share with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes, against all odds, hope prevails when we refuse to let it die.